Exciting. I think that's us started, Gordon and company,
Right?
and fingers crossed, some form of beautiful audience streaming from cyberspace. This is our first Scotia live interview via the wonders of Skype and YouTube live stream. So thanks to anyone who's watching us right this second, or anyone that's watching us in the future, because this interview will record and be available afterwards. Today we're talking about pandemic housing justice in the age of the corona crisis, and after and beyond, with Gordon Maloney, who's an organiser with Living Rent, which is Scotland's tenants union. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So first off, before we go through some of the emergency housing legislation that was passed yesterday in the Scottish Parliament, just for people watching who might not have come across your own work or Living Rent before, how would you explain Living Rent as a tenants union and the work it does?
Yeah, so Living Rent, as you said, a tenants union. We're a union for renters in Scotland, both in the private and the social sector. And so our job is to represent and support tenants to fight for better rights, better laws, better kind of legal protections. And the work around this bill has been one example of it. But as well as that, we really see our job as building power amongst tenants. So we do a lot of what we call member defence work, but in a trade union or that kind of environment you might hear referred to as casework. But basically, when individuals are having problems with either their landlord or their letting agent or the council or the housing association or whatever it might be, we can support them. And we try and do that in a way that's quite different from house shelter or other kind of more kind of legalistic approaches might take to it. By rather than like doing the work for the tenant, we really support them to build power, organising with their neighbours, and win that way. Yeah, one of the things we've been doing a lot recently is really trying to build a base in like really going deep into communities and not just kind of like picking out the people who are already active or already like politically engaged from across to cities. And the campaign work we've been doing over the last couple of weeks has been around coronavirus, but we've got a much more long-standing campaign around rent controls, which we can maybe get into in more detail in a bit. But yeah, that's who we are. We've been going for just over 5 years. We stopped. It was just in the aftermath of the independence referendum. A couple of months after that, I think a bunch of us didn't want to stop organising.
Brilliant. So, as we say, the coronavirus sort of emergency bill was passed through Holyrood yesterday in a day, and housing was one of the two major issues of contention alongside the justice proposals. And Living Rent was very vocal prior to the publication of the bill, arguing for sort of changes to housing rights for tenants. So can you maybe explain a little bit about what Living Rent was asking for, and then what you thought about the proposals when they were published?
Yeah, so we were asking for two things. When it became clear that we were going to go into lockdown, we realised very quickly, or it became clear very quickly, that this was obviously a big public health crisis and was going to have big impacts on the NHS and healthcare and all of that. But what it also became really clear very quickly was that this was also going to be a massive financial crisis for tenants, like an individual crisis for people in that sense. And we already have a situation where enormous numbers of tenants are only ever one or two paychecks away from not being able to afford their rent. And as workplaces began to shut their door, it was becoming clear that people weren't going to be able to pay their rents through no fault of their own, not just because they had coronavirus or they were having to self-isolate, but because the places they work in hospitality or something like that, were going to be shut. And so we wanted to make sure two things. One, that no one faced eviction during this period, partly because if they can't afford their rents because of their workplace is shut down, that's no fault of their own. They shouldn't face destitution because of that. But partly because so that was in terms of rent arrears. But we actually were saying that no one should be evicted for any reason, because during a lockdown, it's going to be impossible to find a new place to live. Letting agents won't be doing visits, flat viewings, things like that. Most letting agents are going to be closed or at least not operating in the same way. It wouldn't be fair on other tenants living in the properties to have kind of parades of strangers coming in doing viewings while they're trying to self-isolate. So that was what we were asking for around eviction. We wanted a total ban on all evictions in both the private and the social sectors. The other thing we were asking for, and this was just as important, is around protecting tenants from the financial impacts of coronavirus, and specifically asking for rents to be written off during this period at a time when people can't work. And we've seen some movement from the government down south around guaranteeing people's wages, but by no means does it go far enough, and huge numbers of tenants will be in the categories of people who slip through the cracks. So whether you're self-employed or they're by no means perfect measures, those people are going to have no ability to pay their rent. And at the time when we were launching the campaign, the Scottish Government's guidance to tenants was, if you're struggling or if you're worried you're going to struggle, to just go and speak to your landlord and kind of see if you can negotiate something with them. And we were getting inundated with messages from tenants who had done that, who'd followed that advice in good faith, and were told in no uncertain terms, if you don't pay the rent on April 1st, I will kick you out. And so it became really clear that relying on the goodwill of landlords was a dead end in far too many cases, and that we needed strong legal protections, firstly from eviction, and then secondly from having to pay rent in a situation where paying rent is impossible for people.
So what did you think about the proposals that the government came out with?
Well, so the proposals from the government came out kind of in two stages. So last week, or the week before, they made an initial announcement about a week after we'd launched our campaign, where they proposed to... they said they were banning evictions, but actually what they were proposing was one measure, which would be to extend... So currently, or in normal times, you have to be in rent arrears for 3 months before your landlord can begin proceedings to evict you. And they were proposing to extend those 3 months to 6 months, so that you would have to have been in rent arrears for 6 months before your landlord could evict you. And that was the original proposal. And we were very clear that that wasn't good enough. Firstly, because that's only one of more than 18 grounds. Lots of tenants are still on the old form of tenancy, where your landlord doesn't need any ground whatsoever to evict you. And we were clear that if you ban that sort of eviction, but still allow all the others, tenants are still going to be evicted. And the landlord will just say it's not because of arrears, it's because of something else. So we pushed hard for them to go further and did an awful lot of work around that. So we had 16,000 people signed a petition, thousands of people wrote to the housing minister, people were phoning the housing spokespeople of the various parties. And then last week they came out with what we thought was a much improved proposal, and that was to ban all evictions in both the private and the social sector for 6 months. It turns out there's one exemption, which is around criminality or antisocial behaviour, which on the surface, well, I think we want to understand the detail around that and how that's going to play out in practice. But it does seem that that's one of the ones that a landlord couldn't they'd have to be able to point to something concrete in order to use that, in a way that, for example, if they say they're planning to sell the house, they don't really need any evidence to do that. So it feels like on evictions, what they've done is good and right. There's a couple caveats to that, which we can discuss. And so feel very positive about that. One thing to say is it took a lot of work from tenants' organisations, from us, from Shelter, from various other organisations to make them get there. And that was disappointing, I have to say, that what they came out with originally was so poor. But it's good that we got where we got in the end. What we need to understand now is what happens after these 6 months, because there are huge numbers of tenants who aren't going to be able to pay their rent over this period. And if no measures are put in place to protect them, then what we're looking at is the moment these limits on eviction are lifted, a huge wave of evictions that I think could be devastating, not just for tenants, but actually to the kind of social fabric of the country as a whole.
So that's really interesting, raises sort of big social and economic questions, as you say, 6 months down the line, if there's a build-up in rent arrears in these cases, there's been some gains, as you say, against imminent evictions, but then what happens later? I think that's something for people to try and think about. One of the main dramas of the debate yesterday that illustrated these sort of different social interests came between the different housing spokespeople, as you say, the people that your organisation was lobbying. So you had Kevin Stewart, the housing minister, having to put through this legislation for the government. You had Andy Whiteman and Ross Greer, who are both Green MSPs, trying to push further on specific policies. Mr. Whiteman, who's got a great deal of expertise in property law, was arguing for specific requisition powers to be outlined to local authorities, so they could buy up or sort of take requisition property to use for homeless people or key workers. Ross Greer was asking for students to be allowed to basically get out of their any lets without long notice periods, so they wouldn't have to keep paying rent for somewhere they didn't live. And Pauline McNeill was raising this issue of future sort of rent holidays or non-payments. And on the other side of the spectrum, you had the Tory housing spokesperson kind of throwing all this out the window and saying, to paraphrase, it doesn't matter how many houses you own, poor landlords. If you own 2, 3, 4, 5 properties, you're not necessarily wealthy. So what did you make of the differences in approach there?
Well, look, let's talk about the Tory one properly. I think the points that Ross Greer, Andy Whiteman, and Pauline McNeill were making are all very good and very important. Specifically on this point about requisitioning, I think it was specifically around holiday lets for homeless people and key workers. It is unconscionable that we have that amount. Estimates vary. They reckon maybe 10,000 whole property holiday lets sitting empty at a time when homelessness shelters are being shut because there are massive risks of kind of pandemic spreading there. There comes a point, and I think Ross Greer made the point very, very eloquently when he talked about the balance of human rights and sure, landlords have there's an enshrined right to property, but that has to be balanced against rights around public health and around public safety. I think this is a clear example where the public safety interest trumps the right for a landlord to have a property sitting empty. So those are important points. And on the student housing one, so the issue here is often students sign for a year-long contract, but now most of those halls have shut down. People have been sent home, and students are trapped paying those leases. Clearly wrong. Kevin Stewart kind of indicated that there might be some movement there. It'd be interesting to see. And I understand that tenants in Glasgow, tenants of student housing, have been talking about a rent strike around it. So it'd be interesting to see how that develops. But the situation as it stands is clearly not right. On the point from the Tories, so I think Murdo Fraser tweeted in advance that Andy Whiteman's proposals amounted to, I think it was a touch of communism. It's not the language of someone who's trying to engage in a serious debate. Graham Simpson, Tory housing spokesperson, made the point that if you've only got 1 to 5 homes, you're not necessarily wealthy. This is a nonsense. If you have 5 spare homes, you are wealthy. But I think I'm interested not in the hyperbole and the kind of political back and forth in Parliament. What I'm really interested in is what the Tories actually managed to negotiate. So it seems, and it wasn't the drama of the debate, but it was let slip that the Scottish Government seemed, as I understood it, seemed to have agreed with the Tories that as a condition for their support in the bill, they would set up an emergency fund for landlords who were struggling. Tenants, I should say, have been offered no such support. There's no emergency fund for tenants who aren't going to be able to afford their rent. We're hearing lots of stories of tenants whose landlords are being granted mortgage holidays or who we understand will be able to access support and aren't passing that on to the tenants. And so I think this isn't just a question of different approaches. It's a question of whose material interests the Scottish Government are protecting here. And there is clearly a balance to strike. And when we were running when we were kind of waging the campaign, as it were, people were saying, well, the Scottish Government doesn't have the power to just fork out the money. But there is a political choice to make here. Someone is going to be out of pocket if no new money materialises. And the choice is whether it's the tenants who are already in difficult, precarious situations, or it's the landlords, some of whom, as Graham Simpson boasted, only have between 1 and 5 homes. And to me, seem like people who clearly have the material means to weather a bit of a storm in a way that tenants just don't. And I'm optimistic. Let's see what happens over the coming months. But as things currently stand, we have some very important protections from eviction, but very little else for tenants. And a whole raft of measures, mortgage holidays, buy-to-let mortgage holidays, this new emergency fund for landlords, that seems disproportionate when what tenants are being given is, well, sign on for universal credit.
So I've got sort of 2 general comments or responses to make on the sort of Tory position here. And the first is just some facts and some accuracy about wealth in Scotland. There does seem to be quite a common misconception about what property ownership, how central property ownership and home ownership is to private wealth. A lot of people seem to think it's just a kind of common universal thing to own your own property, when really that is a sign of wealth. It's a sign that you're on the wealthier side of the spectrum. And I'm just going to post in the sort of chat alongside the live stream at the moment a link to the most recent statistics on that for Scotland, published just at the start of this year, that show that 34% of households in Scotland have no property wealth at all. The bottom third of society are just not part of this conversation whatsoever, never mind owning several properties. So I thought I'd just mention that for useful context if people hadn't seen those numbers before. The second is more of a question back to you, Gordon, and it actually fits in with the question that James McFarlane has just posted in the sort of live stream chat of questions. If anyone else has any questions and is watching, please throw them in and we'll try and deal with them at the end. But this one fits quite perfectly in with what we were just discussing, which is the Scottish Government approach. And it's something Gordon and I, we kind of preempted, because I was speaking to you about it just a few weeks ago, about the legal advice that the Scottish Government gets. And the government rejected these proposals from both Ross Greer and Andy Whiteman on the grounds of legal advice and the legal wing of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Government Legal Directorate. And it's particularly how they interpret property rights in Article 1, Protocol 1 of the European Convention of Human Rights, and the requirement for legislation that goes through the Scottish Parliament to be compatible with ECHR because it's open to legal challenge. And for those that aren't too familiar with what happens behind the scenes in devolution, this is what keeps ministers awake at night. It's what they're very afraid of. From personal experience, I know they're very concerned and worried about possible legal challenges and legal defeats that could knock down legislation. James McFarlane specifically mentions the case of Salveson against Riddle, which was one of the most high-profile cases of this. So I just wanted to know whether Living Rent has a perspective on that, whether you think, for instance, the Scottish Government should be less afraid of private property interests taking them to court, and they should be willing to take them on in the legal sphere.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a couple dynamics to this, and it's the kind of delicacies of human rights law are not my expertise. I think Ross Greer made a very articulate point about how there's always a balance to strike here, and even within the context of the human rights legislation that was being referenced, there's scope for that to be balanced against kind of public health, public safety, and kind of broader public interest. I think this is an example where it is clearly in the public interest, not just in terms of the human rights of the individuals who are potentially being asked to sleep rough during a global pandemic, but actually in terms of the public health situation more widely, that if you have people who aren't able to self-isolate, that puts not just them at risk, but it puts everyone that they may come into contact with at risk. So I think there is a balance to strike here. But look, the broader point is politics isn't some technocratic, manoeuvring kind of game of chess. It's a matter of choices, of priorities, and of interests. And there are lots of examples of times when the Scottish Government has had legal advice or has had pushback on proposals and has fought hard to make it happen. Minimum alcohol pricing is the obvious example where if they didn't want to have done it, and if the pressure was coming from elsewhere, and some getting legal advice that this isn't possible would be enough for them to just stop it. But it was a political priority for the Scottish Government, and they saw it through and made it happen. And I think when it comes to housing, there is always the nature of our housing model at the moment means that there's always going to be a well-oiled, slick, powerful, extremely well-resourced lobby against anything that will infringe on their profits, and they're going to pull out every measure they can. They'll talk about human rights law, they'll talk about negative consequences, adverse side effects on the economy and all this stuff. And the Scottish Government has to be willing to confront them, because the alternative is it's homeless people being kicked out of emergency accommodation and being left with nothing. It's tenants being forced into poverty through sky-high rents. It's entire communities being broken up by holiday lets and Airbnb. All the while, the owners of this accommodation making astronomical profits. That is clearly not a situation that we can allow to continue.
Okay, so before moving on to the sort of final couple of questions, I'll just say to people that Scotia will hopefully have a lot more planned on covering that aspect of the kind of legal constraints on devolution and what actually happens behind the scenes, what legal processes seem to moderate, to put it politely, devolved legislation at Holyrood, as we saw again yesterday when more progressive measures were rejected on this basis of legal claims about the European Convention and property rights. But Gordon, I suppose the future, you've now got a big fight on your hands about trying to get sort of rent payments covered in some form, potentially through the social security system, and the longer term question of implementing real rent controls. And for those who haven't followed that debate, Living Rent were successful, remarkably successful in managing to get that on the agenda for the 2016 Housing Tenancy Scotland Act. But the powers in that were, certainly in my opinion, incomplete and ineffective, and we've seen a complete failure of any councils to use them. Apparently some of the reasons about that are in relation to sort of data gathering and the way the powers were designed. So you've got those two challenges, the rent payments issue and rent controls leading up to the 2021 election. Is that a sort of fair appraisal of the challenges ahead?
Yeah, I think so. Well, so on the immediate situation around coronavirus, the current proposals that are on the table are clearly insufficient. The support being offered by the government is clearly not good enough at the UK level and at the Scottish level. The prospect of tenants to simply ask their landlord for support is clearly a dead end. We need more, and we're going to be working hard to make sure that happens. I think getting evictions banned was a necessary prerequisite to that. But look, in other places, in Spain this week, tenants announced a nationwide rent strike, and I think we need to understand that if the Scottish Government isn't willing to make some kind of movement, tenants are going to have to start working out what their response to that is. But there are also going to be huge numbers of people who simply can't afford to pay their rent, and for them, there's no choice. It's not some kind of deliberate political action. They just won't have the money. The Scottish Government have to understand quite how serious the situation is, and how serious the situation is going to be in 6 months' time if once the ban on evictions is lifted, if no better support is given. On the bigger picture, on rent controls, I agree with you that what was proposed in 2016 was a kind of failure on its own terms. But for me, what coronavirus has underlined is this, that we are now seeing a situation where huge numbers of tenants all at the same time have lost their job and are all facing kind of real uncertainty and precarious situations all at the same time. But the truth is that people were always in that situation. Instead of it happening to hundreds of thousands of tenants at once, it was happening to people individually. Your mum gets sick and you take time off work to look after her. You lose your job, or your hours get cut, or you have a big unexpected expense, a big MOT or something like that, and suddenly you can't afford your rent. And so for me, emergency measures around eviction and rent holidays really, really important. But what coronavirus underlines is just how broken our housing model has been allowed to become anyway. And what we cannot have after this is simply a return to what we had before. The Scottish Government has to take this as a wake-up call about how bad the housing situation is. And for us, one of the key things there is rent controls. The norm across Europe, they were the norm here in Scotland until Thatcher scrapped them. And it is a necessary step if we want to get anywhere closer to striking a balance between the interests of landlords and profit and the interests of ordinary, normal working people being able to kind of live and make a life in our cities. Because right now the situation is untenable.
It won't come as a surprise for anyone that sort of follows my own personal politics of one of Edinburgh's other ginger beardy men, that I agree with that. I think those that don't understand the politics of housing and the tenants movement don't understand how closely connected it is to issues of wealth, of inequality, of power, of security, of good public health, which is of course what we're all most worried about right now. They need to improve housing conditions for more equal health outcomes, and certainly a warning to anyone in the Scottish establishment who isn't following that politics or taking it seriously is what happened in the Irish election, where the issue of housing justice was the platform that propelled Sinn Féin as a kind of left-wing insurgent populist party to win the popular vote. And I certainly think that anyone, the SNP and the Scottish Government shouldn't underrate how important housing could be as an issue in the election next year.
Definitely agree, especially if we're just 6 months out from a massive wave of evictions.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Gordon, for your time, for joining us. We've had a handful of people watching us live. James sent us over a question. But obviously anyone that's been watching or is watching in the future, please sort of share, like and subscribe to the channel as we hopefully put out more sort of interviews like this over our imprisonment for however long that may last. It's been a delight speaking to you, Gordon, and having an update. Obviously people can follow Living Rent as well, follow all the campaigning that they're doing, and Gordon himself he's an avid tweeter. If you want to follow his opinions on the housing situation and many others. Also posts a lot of good food pictures if you're into that. We were just talking about pasta before we went live. I was trying to get some tips.
Yeah, if you want pasta tips, do tweet me. I've got some.
Do you want to plug anything else before we say goodbye, Gordon?
Well, look, I made the point that the housing lobby, the landlord lobby, is extremely well resourced. They're well resourced because they take our money every month. I would say to people that the only way we're going to have a hope of fighting back is by building a well resourced lobby and building power of our own. And at the moment, the biggest contribution people can make to that is if you are a tenant, if you do rent in Scotland, join Living Rent. It's livingrent.org/join. And if you're not eligible to be a tenant, you can sign up as a supporter, or you can make a one-off donation at the same link. It's the only chance we're going to have of organising a fight back that has any hope of winning. So it's really important that people get stuck in.
Brilliant. It's always good to have some hope in a time of crisis and uncertainty.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you everyone for watching. Yeah.